Hi, I'm Rupert Scott and this is my vlog on skills and capacities in the weight room. I've chosen the back squat and the Romanian deadlift, referred to as the RDL from here on out, as my two weight room activities to analyse. Throughout the video, I'll be highlighting issues with the performance of the activity and determining if it is due to a lack of skill or issue with the athlete's capacities. Once I've determined whether the issue is due to skill or capacities limitations through a variation of tests, I will then take the athlete through methods to improve the performance of the activity with coaching cues, varying exercises, and also corrective exercises. Our first athlete has a skill issue. As you can see here, the athlete uses a wide stance with a very straightforward foot position. He reaches parallel in his squat pretty easily, but struggles to go any lower. We discussed this as well, and he told me that the wide stance and the straight foot position was something he'd been coached, but he did not feel entirely comfortable and struggled for depth. As you can see from the side view here, there's a slight anterior pelvic tilt. This could be a structural issue, as his ankle range of motion is pretty sufficient. He does have relatively upright torso, and his bar path stays inside his base of support, so this does not lead to any excessive shearing force in the lumbar spine. From the back, we can see there's a slight knee valgus and foot pronation, especially on the right hand side. This possibly could be caused as there is a slight shift to the left hand side, which is forcing that knee inwards. Again, you can see that the bar on his back isn't entirely straight as well, and we'll look into that on the next. As we can see from this image, the athlete has an uneven bar in his back. Through testing, looking at his thoracic spine mobility, we see there's no capacity issue there. And we actually fixed this problem by a simple coaching method of cueing him to pull the bar tightly into himself and imagine snapping the bar in his back. This actively changed his bar position very, very quickly. The next issue we had here was the knee valgus and the pronation, which is more pronounced on the right hand side. We went through a range of tests that you'll see after this slide. We went through ankle range of motion, hip mobility, and there were no issues with this. He was very mobile through these ranges of motion. This suggested to me that it wasn't a capacity issue and that there was a possible skill problem. So what we discussed was talking about a narrower stance with his feet pointed out slightly more to allow him to drive his knees over his toes. The athlete also didn't possess any weaknesses. As we can see, when he takes a narrow stance, he is very capable of driving his knees and externally rotating at the hip to allow for good patella tracking. As you can see here, the athlete has good ankle range of motion on both sides, and this was completed without a knee valgus to increase range of motion. The athlete also had more than sufficient hip range of motion. As you can see here, he creates more than enough hip flexion to be able to get the required depth he wishes to in his back squat. The athlete's thoracic mobility was also very good. He showed slight lumbar flexion whilst performing the exercises, but this was not too much of an issue. He shows good shoulder range of motion and thoracic mobility throughout this. This suggests that his uneven bar was due to him not actively pulling the bar into his back. Unfortunately, the athlete had a lower back injury from volleyball, so we had to complete the testing with bodyweight squats. As you can see here, he really struggles to hit the depth, and it's an uncomfortable movement for him, and his knees cave in slightly on the way down. Here you can see that he is hitting much better depth with a slightly closer together stance and his feet turned out. He hits this depth with a much more comfortable squat. So here you can see with his wide stance, he got a knee angle of 60 degrees compared to 73 degrees, which really suggests that the wide stance was preventing him from getting any deeper into the squat. It's difficult to tell how much effect this will have with a bar because of obviously his injury, but I believe that having a slightly narrower stance, turning his feet out, will allow him to find the extra depth that he wants to. On the next slide, we can see that the slightly narrower stance allows him to drive his knees out over his toes and prevent the valgus and the pronation, again, which fixes the first skill issue we had. The second athlete has a capacity issue. As you can see here, our athlete has a pretty narrow stance with feet facing forward. He can't reach any kind of depth. His hands really aren't very tight on the bar and close in, so he's struggling to really snap that bar into his back. From the side here again, you can see there's no depth to the squat, and he really struggles. Again, his wrists are broken, so that's not really an active pulling the bar into the back and creating a stable midsection. From the back here, you can see that
He's struggling for depth again. He's shifting slightly to the left. We then tested his ankle range of motion, and there was very little ankle range of motion, and he really had to push himself into valgus to get any kind of range of motion. We then tested the athlete's thoracic mobility. As you can see here, he possibly has upper cross syndrome with very little thoracic extension and very small amount of shoulder range of motion, and this probably has an effect on his hand position on the bar. We then checked his hip mobility, and again you can see here he's really struggling to get his hip into a deep flexion. This again will determine his squat depth and where you can see that he cannot reach parallel. As you can see here, his joint angle at the knee is very, very limited, so he really struggles to get that depth. The rest of the squat isn't too bad, and I think the main part that we need to work on is the squat depth and the possible ankle range of mobility and hip range of motion. Another thing that we need to look at is the angle of his hands on the bar. You can see that his wrist is snapped, and this is not creating a good stable tension throughout his upper body.
To help improve the athlete's hip range of motion, we took him through a simple frog stretch. This will hopefully help his hip flexion and also hip external rotation, allowing him to drive his knees further out and therefore creating more depth in the squat.
We then worked on a little bit of ankle range of motion to go with the increased hip flexibility. If he can allow his knees to travel forward over his toes and allow a bit of tibial translation, then this will again help the depth of the squat. We also wanted the athlete to actively pull the bar into his back and activate his lats. We did this little test with him to increase this in the squat. As you can see, these several exercises automatically increase his range of motion, and if we continue to do these exercises with him over a prolonged period of time, this will again help his squat no end.
Our first athlete with the RDL has a skill issue.
Again, the athlete couldn't use a full weight due to lower back injury, so here we just used a dowel of some kind. He's performing the RDL, he's got a good stance. As you can see, his shoulder blades are not retracted, they're not pulled down, he's not got them in a safe, stable position, and you'll be able to see that better here. His hips move back slightly, and you can see that his range of motion is very, very good, but the bar moves away from his body throughout the lift. As we can see here, the bar is quite a way away from his midfoot, his centre foot, and it's away from his body. This is not optimal and can put pressure on the lower back, so we really wanted to change that. We can also see here that his shoulders are forward of his spine, and when we are performing an RDL, we really want those scapula to be retracted and pulled down, keeping the bar nice and tight to your body, and preventing pressure on your lower back. I know this is a skill issue due to Jordan's Capacities force production, and his range of motion at all joints is very substantial. So what we wanted to do was give him some simple coaching cues to try and fix this. We wanted him to stick his hips backwards to start the movement, have his shoulder blades drawn back and downwards, and keep that bar close to his quad and shin throughout the entire motion. As you can see here, it's a much better movement, it's a lot more hinge, and this takes pressure off his lower back and activates the hamstrings more.
Our second athlete for the RDL has a skill issue. The athlete clearly doesn't have a very good range of motion here. This is due to tight hamstrings and also weak unactivated glutes. He has a forward shoulder position and upper cross syndrome due to his working in front of a computer throughout the entire day. So what we want to do is try and strengthen the upper back to allow for shoulder blade retraction. Here we can see that the athlete's shoulders are forward and head is forward of his spine, and we really want his hips to go further back, and this will hopefully allow him to get greater depth into the RDL. We will try and achieve that through some corrective exercises. Before completing the RDL, we got the athlete to stretch out his hamstrings. This should allow him to get a greater range of motion when completing the RDL. The athlete also had a problem firing his glutes to the concentric portion of the RDL, so what we wanted to do before completing the exercise was get his glutes firing using a glute bridge with a band. As you can see now, the athlete has a much better recruitment pattern. His knees are driven out through the entire movement, and it is a much better RDL through improving his capacity.
In conclusion, skill and capacity are very much linked. For example, an improvement in capacity will more than likely lead to an improvement in the performance of the skill.